Good evening, everybody. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. I'm Simon Haynes. Welcome back to the Ramsay Lecture series in this beautiful space at the Mint. Welcome from me and also on behalf of our chairman, John Howard, who sends his regrets that he was unable to join us this evening, though I'm sure he would be as delighted as I am to welcome his opposite number, the chairman of the Paul Ramsay Foundation, Michael Trail. Welcome to you, Michael. And of course, we at the centre are extremely grateful to the Paul Ramsay Foundation for their support. It's fantastic to see such a good turnout, especially on a Friday night at this slightly later time. Can I just ask, are there any Ramsay scholars in the room? If so, please, great. Please raise your hands. Fantastic to see you. You are always the most important people in the room. Keep coming, bring your colleagues and your friends, because the Ramsay Centre is an educational enterprise above everything else. We're nothing if we're not that, and that means we're all about the next generation. So as usual, I'd just like to start briefly by acknowledging our extraordinary benefactor, the late Paul Ramsay, without whom nothing that we do, the scholarships at undergraduate and postgraduate levels, the university support for the humanities, or any of these events would be possible. Paul wished the Ramsay Centre to have a starring role in his truly unique legacy. So we always do our best to honour and respect and enact that wish of Paul's. So thank you, Paul Ramsay. Before we start, if I can just beg the indulgence of our distinguished guest this evening and just give a short plug to some other forthcoming Ramsay events coming up. Don't miss them. Watch our website for the exact dates. We will, among others, be hearing online from Professor Rémi Brague at the University of Paris later in the year, one of today's most eminent historians of philosophy and thinkers about the nature of the West. And he'll be talking about his famous best-selling book, Eccentric Cultures, A Theory of Western Civilization. And I'd like to reassure audiences that this will be in English, not in French, but it'll be online later on in this year. In September, we'll be hosting live, probably either in this room or down the road at the library. Professor Robert Toombs from Cambridge will be talking about his History Reclaimed project, which, to use his words in their website, is intended to push back against false readings of history, which create or aggravate divisions, resentments, and even violence in society. So that'll be good. And at a date we can't yet confirm because various Middle Eastern heads of state are involved in the permissions and the arrangements for her archaeological digs, we are confident of finally welcoming live the distinguished historian and broadcaster Bettany Hughes from Cambridge to be in Sydney in an unspecified but absolutely certain future time. She's done a couple of wonderful talks already for us online, as you may know, and many of you will have seen Bettany's SBS series on Sunday evenings, so it will be a treat to see her here in person, so don't miss that and watch our website for details. More immediately, however, at a date at the very end of May or early June, 30, 31, 1 in there, we will be hosting a special panel on secondary education in Australia, featuring, among other luminaries, our very own Elizabeth Stone, a distinguished member of the Ramsay Centre board, also the departing principal of Queenwood College in Sydney. And as you may be aware, Elizabeth was recently appointed the head of no less august an institution than Winchester College in England. She is the first woman and the first Australian in 650 years to be appointed to that position. She'll be joined by several others, but including Elena Douglas, the CEO of the social purpose business called the Knowledge Society. So do come along in a month or so. Please don't miss that very special event. Even though the Ramsay Centre is obviously more preoccupied with the tertiary sector than the secondary one is where it all begins. Very, very important. So that'll be a very good evening. Finally, just on housekeeping, please remember that after the event today, you are most welcome to stay back and join us for snacks and drinks in the lobby and meet our guest outside. So now it's a great honor and pleasure for the Ramsay Center to welcome tonight's speaker. He has a very crowded schedule, very rushed in the short time that he's here, and we are especially grateful to him for making the time to come and speak to us. He's just off the flight from the US, so it's amazing that he's here. He's Professor Joseph Henrich, and Joe is the Ruth Moore Professor of Biological Anthropology at Harvard University. Previously, he was a professor of both economics and psychology at the University of British Columbia, where he held the Canada Research Chair in Culture, Cognition, and Coevolution. His research uses evolutionary approaches to psychology, decision-making, and culture. He integrates ethnographic tools from anthropology with experimental techniques drawn from psychology and economics. And he's explored in this way a variety of topics, including economic decision-making, social norms, fairness, religion, marriage, prestige, cooperation, and innovation. He's done long-term fieldwork in Peru, in Chile, and in the South Pacific, and has spearheaded several large comparative projects. He won in 2004 the Presidential Early Career Award for Young Scientists, and in 2009 the Early Career Award for Distinguished Contributions bestowed by the Human Behavior and Evolution Society. And in 2018, he was awarded the Wegner Prize for Theoretical Innovation by the Society for Personality and Social Psychology. In 2016, Joe published The Secret of Our Success with Princeton, and now in 2020, the best-selling book that he's going to tell us about now, The Weirdest People in the World, who it turns out are basically us. So our fourth Ramsay Lecture for 2023 is called Weird Minds, How Religion, Marriage, and the Family Made the West Psychologically Peculiar and Particularly Prosperous. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Joe Henrich.
It's great to be here. We're really glad we can make this work out, so my thanks to the organizers. So as Simon mentioned, I want to tell you a little bit about my book. And one of the key things I'm going to be focusing on is the emerging picture of psychological diversity that's emerging from studies in lots of places, and my efforts to try to explain a slice of that psychological variation. All right, so I thought to get us started, I'd administer to you a psychological tool called the I am task, or the who am I task. So what I want you to do is try to finish this sentence in 3 ways, and you're thinking about how you might describe yourself to someone else. So I am, and then whatever you want to say. So normally psychologists would do this 20 times, and they've had people all over the world finish this task in different places. And then you can add up the way people respond to this and code it in different ways, and you get interesting patterns. So go ahead. All right, so I might answer this by saying I am Jessica's father, I am a brother, I am Ara's friend, although that's probably not how I would actually answer it. Instead, I might say something like I am curious, I am a scientist, I am a sea kayaker. Right? So in the first one, I'm telling you about my relationships and my connections. In the second one, I'm telling you facts about myself that I might want you to know. Even the scientist one, it's a group, right? But it's kind of a strange group, and I don't pick up fellow scientists at the airport because we're both fellow scientists. So it's more about me than it is about the group. And so on one end, we have attributes, aspirations, and accomplishments, things about myself chosen by me, versus roles and relationships. And this varies quite dramatically around the world in terms of the degree to which people think of themselves as nodes in a social network versus unitary selves that are embodied by certain characteristics or described by certain characteristics. So this has long been noticed by anthropologists. It's part of the individualism complex. So Clifford Geertz, an anthropologist at Princeton, described it back in the early 70s, writing, "The Western conception of the person as a bounded, unique, and more or less integrated motivational and cognitive universe is, however incorrigible it may seem to us, a rather peculiar idea within the context of the world's cultures." So that's this notion of the self, but that seems to go along with some other stuff. So the focus on the self, the atomic view of the self, also a sense of guilt. Now, guilt in this sense is contrasted with shame. So anthropologists have long distinguished guilt and shame-based societies. In a shame-based society, there's a large number of social norms, and you're concerned about violating those social norms, losing face in the eyes of others. Shame is contagious, or not contagious, but it extends from people besides yourself. So if your brother does something shameful, then you feel shame as a consequence. Whereas guilt is about living up to your own personal standards. So if you don't go to the gym on a particular day, you might feel guilty, but your brother's not going to be judged by your neighbors because you didn't go to the gym. Overconfidence, so individuals tend to be overconfident, and we've done a lot of research on this ourselves, and it's true overconfidence in the sense that people actually do overrate their own abilities. And self-enhancement is just putting your best foot forward, always emphasizing your best characteristics. So those all kind of tend to cluster together. So that's a little global map of the world, and you guys can see you're on the map, you're dark blue. The most individualistic societies in the world, we beat you at 91, but the Australians come in at 90, close second, not bad, and then the British are at 89. So a lot of variation in there, and you might think, well, that's interesting, so people think about the self. Does this really matter for stuff that we care about? So one of the hats I like to put on from time to time, I was a professor of economics. So it doesn't matter. So this is just a plot of individualism and patents per million people. So rates of innovation. I could put GDP. I could put lots of different measures there. Now, this actually comes from a paper published in a lead economic journal. And those economists tried to make the case that this is a causal relationship, that greater individualism is associated with this. I think it probably is too, although for this point, it's enough to just say, look, there's an interesting correlation here. And does that really matter? So I'm going to come back to this, but just suggesting that there's some economic importance going on here. All right, now the individualism complex is just the tip of an iceberg, and that we really don't know how deep it goes, this psychological iceberg. So some other examples of psychological variation we find in the world is the use of intentions and moral judgment. So this might seem very strange, right? So if somebody steals something, if they do it on purpose or if they do it by accident, it should matter a lot in how much they punish people. Well, we've done studies all around the world, and there's quite a bit of variation. Western societies, the mental states the person had are crucially important in making any sort of judgment. Which, just to kind of, if you just think about it for a second, mental states, we can never really know what was in someone else's mind. So any punishment that's assigned based on mental states is an inference that we have to make about something that's fundamentally unknowable. It might think of, that might be something that you might not want to include in a judicial proceeding. But in Western judicial proceedings, that's very important, establishing these hidden, unknowable mental states. In other places, only outcomes matter. Only what actually happened matters. So if you burn someone's house down, you're an arsonist, whether you did it on purpose or you did it by accident. Analytic versus holistic thinking, that has to do with how we approach problems. Do we look for objects and assign properties to them and then try to explain the behavior of the system based on the properties we've assigned to those objects? Or do we look at the relations and interconnections between things? Just a simple example of analytic thinking would be psychologists assign people personalities or other dispositional traits and then try to explain behavior based on that. Physicists assign properties to particles and then try to explain behavior based on that. Economists assign preferences to individuals, same thing. Whereas holistic thinking, it would be about the relationships. So if one person is angrily yelling at another person, you might say, well, he's an angry person. That's a dispositional attribution and a weird way of describing things. A relational person would say there's a problem in their relationship. Or maybe the older person is trying to teach something to the younger person and really wanted to impress it upon them. Anyway, so different ways of approaching that. A non-relational morality versus a universalistic morality, just the question of whether moral things apply to everybody or just small groups, or there should be different rules for different kinds of relationships. I've said a lot about dispositional thinking when I was talking about analytic thinking, but this comes out in two pieces of psychology you might be familiar with. So the fundamental attribution error, if you've taken a course in social psychology, you might have heard of the fundamental attribution error. It turns out not to be so fundamental. And it's this tendency to ascribe internal or dispositional reasons for something. So if someone doesn't show up at work, maybe they're lazy. That would be a dispositional attribution, as opposed to a situational, they got a flat tire, something like that. So that's the fundamental attribution error. Doesn't appear everywhere, seems to be a phenomena of weird people. And then cognitive dissonance. So wanting to be consistent across contexts. It bothers Westerners, individualists a lot. It doesn't bother lots of other populations. Okay, so this, I can keep going down this thing, trust in strangers, conformity, and patience. And one of the points I make is that there's been so little research across diverse populations that we're really not sure how deep the iceberg goes. Okay, so I've been using this term weird. It stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And two colleagues of mine, Steve Heine and Ara Norenzayan, we coined this term as a way of raising the consciousness of our fellow researchers to remind them that when they just study Americans or they just study Western subjects, not only are they getting one slice amongst a spectrum of cultural diversity, but they're getting an unusual slice. It's not even like the median population. It's some more outlier population. So you want to be very careful about generalizing to the species as a whole. At the time we raised these concerns back in 2010, the evidence suggested that 96% of all participants in psychology studies came from weird societies. 70% of those are Americans, and then you go up from there to the 96. So it's heavily dominated by Americans and weird people. Now, there's a cluster of traits that all go together that turn out to be these kind of unusual traits that characterize weird people. But I want to mention one of the reactions that people have to often this psychological variation is there's a tendency to think, well, this is just this superficial psychological variation. So when I give this talk to cognitive scientists, I use a totally different language, and I talk about things that are very cognitive sciencey. So I can show you differences in memory. People remember to differing degrees across societies. In different aspects of memory are different. Attention varies, visual perception varies, spatial reasoning varies, time psychology varies, and more. So you can carve this up in different ways, and some of the basic aspects that a cognitive scientist would say, that's good, hard cognitive science, would also vary. Okay, and then the final is a kind of caution. One of the things I found is that by coining this term weird, people have a tendency to build up a dichotomy in their mind between weird and non-weird societies. And that kind of the language sort of naturally suggests it. But just to give you a sense of why that's a mistake, if I was telling you about octopi, and then you made up the category non-octopi, that wouldn't tell you very much about the non-octopi, right? All the other animals are in that category, so it doesn't help you triangulate in. You would just know they're not like the octopi. So that's just meant to try to avoid making that dichotomy in your mind. Finally, a cautionary note, and this comes from my experience of having given this talk many times to many different groups, is that I have to use these aspects of psychology to characterize people. And I'm not trying to be critical of weird people or non-weird people, making the thing I just said not to do. And one of the things that this comes off is when particular psychological traits are valued in your society or common in your society, you tend to value it. In the case, is it good to be conformist? But thinking that that's a bad thing is actually illustrating just how weird you are if you think being a conformist is a bad thing. Because in lots of places we could do research, and I can point to research showing this, people think conformity is a good thing. And in fact, if you ask people, well, should you teach your children to be conformist? In the US, they say, that's not on the list of important things to teach your kid. In lots of places, it's one of the top things you want to do. You teach your kid to be a conformist. And in fact, in experiments done by Christine Laguerre, who's a developmental psychologist at UT Austin, she showed parents videos of kids either behaving in a conforming way or non-conforming way. And she had parents in Vanuatu and parents in Austin, Texas, say which kids they thought were the smart ones. And the Vanuatu parents all thought the conformists were the smart kids. And the Texas parents all thought the non-conformists were the smart kids. So this just sort of very, different cultural world. So the people who I'm going to call a conformist think conformity is good. Okay, so here's the two questions. How can we explain the psychological variation around the world? So this is the variation here pictured between out and in-group trust. So we're going to try to do that. And then does this psychological variation influence the kinds of things we care about, outcomes? So democracy, financial markets, innovation, things like that. This is a map of moral universalism versus relational moral universalism. One thing I meant to point out in the individualism plot was that the gray area is terra incognito in terms of our knowledge. So there's vast swaths of the globe where we don't have any data at all for at least some aspects of psychology. So that's an important scientific shortcoming. Okay, so very briefly, I want to lay out for you how I approach and think about cultural evolution and psychological change and the kinds of processes I'm going to be talking about. So here I'm drawing on my 2016 book, The Secret of Our Success. So I'm in the Department of Human Evolutionary Biology at Harvard. I think of humans as animals that have undergone natural selection. We have a common ancestor with chimpanzees about 6 million years ago. 6,000 is somebody else. So I think of two important processes, natural selection and phylogeny. So we can understand a lot about humans just by knowing we're a kind of ape. And then the question is, what has natural selection done in the last 6 million years? So for my purposes, I like to partial out that we have evolved cultural capacities. So more than any other species on Earth, we are really good at observing other people and learning from them, copying ideas, beliefs, values, behaviors, strategies, heuristics, all kinds of things from them. But we also have other evolved aspects of our psychology, which will become important when I talk about kinship and families, which will play an important role in our story. All right, so we can say a lot about how we learn, who we learn from by using the logic of natural selection. We think of culture as an adaptation, our capacity to learn from others. And then over generations, this gives rise to this process of cumulative cultural evolution. So cultural learning plus these other aspects of psychology affect these cultural products or create these cultural products, complex tools, practices and rituals, social norms and institutions, and languages. And I mean, I'm not going to be able to get into this, but one of my interests is how just the ability to learn from each other gives rise to social norms. So shared sets of behavioral practices that have a standard in the sense that if anybody deviates from them, other people get upset, and that leads to stableness in these social norms. So what we've learned is that human brains are relatively plastic, and I've made the case that that's actually by design. So our minds evolved to be plastic in order to adapt to the diversity of worlds that's created by different languages, different social norms, the kind of cultural products. And just an example of some things that we already know vary in response to these things are visual processing. So all of us grew up in a world with 90-degree angle corners. That turns out to be rare across societies, and it gives rise to this Mueller-Lyer illusion. You know, the line with the 2 arrows that go this way or the 2 arrows that go this way? In hunter-gatherer societies, they don't see that illusion because their eyes haven't calibrated to a world with lots of 90-degree angles. Something like self-regulation we know is influenced by devotional and ritual practices. So if you have to do the same thing every day repetitively, you get a degree of self-regulation that you don't get if you don't engage in these things. So that's a cultural practice that then affects a feature of psychology. All right. Okay, and one of the other main points I try to really push in both books, in fact, my opening vignette about the importance of reading, which I'll get to at the end, is meant to deliver home this point, is that these are biological changes in our brains. They're just not genetic changes. So lots of things affect our biology that doesn't have to do with genes. Populations that grow up in different environments become biologically different because we've evolved to change our brains to respond to the social milieus we have to navigate. So non-genetic biological differences. Now, in the long run, I've argued that this cultural process has affected this deeper evolutionary process over hundreds of thousands of years and altered our genetic evolution, although that's not important for today's lecture. Okay, so we're going to be thinking about social norms and institutions, and in particular, I'm interested in the oldest and the most fundamental of human institutions, and that's the one related to marriage and the family. So humans have a bunch of innate features that affect our construction of families. So we have a kinship psychology that we share with lots of other animals. So we're preferentially inclined towards altruism and care towards close relatives. So we know why parents love their children. It falls right out of evolutionary theory. It's really nice. Pair bonding. Like gorillas, we form long-term relationships with members of the opposite sex for the purpose of rearing offspring. But cultural evolution built marriage systems in many societies based on that. There are a couple of exceptions of societies without marriage, but if you look closely, pair bonding still pops up in those societies. It's just not surrounded and sacralized and all the kinds of things that we do to marriage in our society. The same thing with kin psychology. This basic aspect of psychology is then extended by culture in all kinds of interesting ways to other kinds of relatives. And then finally, like other animals, we have to avoid inbreeding, so we have incest aversion. That's why you're disgusted at the idea of sex with your opposite sex sibling. But lots of societies have incest taboos that say you can't marry or have sex with cousins of various kinds. And in fact, one of the most interesting things is that there are taboos on certain kinds of cousins, but then other kinds of cousins who are equidistant are preferred marriage partners. Okay, so this all shapes the fundamental social networks of human societies, who grows up with who's allied with who has responsibilities to who. So it's really kind of rewiring society at a fundamental level. Now, it's important to then realize that the families that many of us are familiar with are unusual in a global perspective. So here's a list of 5 kinship traits. And if you go to the Ethnographic Atlas, which is this database of information about over 1,200 societies that anthropologists compiled in the 1960s, and you look at these different kinship traits, you find that most of the ones that are Western families, that would be necessary for Western families, are rare. So bilateral descent, that's tracing descent through both mom and dad. Surprising to many, it's only 28% of societies in the database have bilateral descent. Elsewhere, it's patrilineal descent or matrilineal descent, or sometimes more complicated things. Little or no cousin marriage. So most societies have cousin marriage. Many societies encourage cousin marriage. So 75% of societies do that. Monogamous marriage, quite rare. Only 15% of societies prevent elite and high-status males from having additional wives. Meanwhile, polyandry, where a woman has multiple husbands, is vanishingly rare in the ethnographic record. So 0.1% of societies have that. It also pops up sometimes, but it's always rare. And then nuclear families, quite rare. 92% of societies don't have nuclear families as the basic structure. And neolocal residence, 95% of societies require the bride and the groom to live either with the husband's family or the wife's family, but not set up a new residence independent of everybody else. So if we add all this up, so these are 5 practices. If you have all 5, you're here. And if you have none of them, you're here. So this is just over 50% of societies in this global database have none of these practices. And then this is the number here that have these 5. If you dig into this data, these are either European descent societies. So this is a global database that includes the Irish of County Cork, Ireland, for example. And so they're in this bin. The other interesting case are Cebu in the Philippines is in this category. And when I dig into the history of the island of Cebu, it turned out that that's where Magellan landed. It's also where he died. And Antonio Pigfetta writes about Magellan, the Chronicles of Magellan. And they clearly had a lot of these practices because Magellan has the Padres on his voyage railing about the polygyny and the other kinds of things which they're engaged in. And then 60 years later, Dominican missionaries arrive. And so before the anthropologists got there, the Dominican missionaries got there. Same thing in North America. Okay, so this is important because families, it's an institution, but it's the first institution humans encounter when they enter the world. And it's also probably the oldest. So, and it's linked into our evolved psychology in important ways. All right, so that's important background. Now, what I'm going to be arguing, so we want to explain weird psychology. And towards the end, I'm going to try to make some links here to suggest that this psychological variation affects these kinds of things. Now, I'm going to make the argument that variation in family and kinship practices affect how people think about the world. And that within Europe, a transformation of these kinship and family practices led to a bunch of features of European history which distinguish it from other places. So the spread of what historians call voluntary associations So guilds, monasteries, universities, and even these charter towns that popped up all over Europe were voluntary associations of a kind you don't, are not common elsewhere. There was competition amongst all these voluntary associations because they were voluntary, so you could move and change and pick the ones you like for the sort of rules of organization. And I'm going to argue that that had an effect. This led to rising urbanization and occupational choice. So in 800 CE, Europe is behind many parts of the world in urbanization, about 1%. In about 1200, Europe passes China, and sometime after 1500, it passes the Middle East and Mediterranean area. So rising urbanization over the entire period. During the same period, there's the proliferation of markets. I think all of these green arrows affect aspects of psychology. And then finally, and this is what I'm going to move to now, is I think this transformation in the family was actually initiated by a set of policies that stem to the church in late antiquity and the medieval church. So the church initiates a bunch of prohibitions on cousin marriage, prohibits polygyny, ends certain kinds of inheritance practices. And so I'll talk more about that in a second. So this is the key mover here which leads to this. And today I'm just going to have time to focus on these three arrows. So the red arrows are historical data, the kind you have to make a historical case, and the green arrows are psychological data. So intellectually, I'm doing something here sort of unusual, is that I'm going to develop theories, I'm going to show historical data to suggest that this has actually happened in the past, and then I'm going to use contemporary data to test the psychological connections, because at the time, I didn't have data on dead people, psychological data. We're figuring out ways to get that, so we're analyzing the Latin corpora. I may yet have that data. Okay, just to give you a sense of the kind of picture I have of why these kinship institutions matter, let's just make a stark contrast. So a world of weak kinship, so nuclear families, you've got to make your way in the world and you have to find all of your own relationships. You've got to find your friends, your business partners, and your mates. In this world, most of your relationships are given at birth. Your marriage is arranged. You work with your cousins. You're a production unit. You don't have another production unit separate from your family. Here you have to cultivate those dispositional attributes. So you want to be smart, honest, clever, anything that you think is going to help you distinguish yourself from others and find those relationships. In this world, your goal is to conform to those expectations of the relationships. You don't need new relationships because you have this kin network you've received at birth. So here you've got to use these personal attributes. So you're judging others on their dispositional attributes and you're trying to cultivate your own. Here, you trust someone, for example, you seek a new business partner based on your connections to them, because it's those social connections that are going to make them trustworthy, not some dispositional trait. So trust based on disposition, based on embeddedness. This is a shame world where you're trying to live up to all these standards, and there's a lot of rules for you to follow. This is a world of guilt where you have to cultivate those traits. So whatever those are, which could vary across individuals, you're trying to live up to those traits. And then here you identify your identity is touched to this cultivated self, this set of attributes you're trying to cultivate, whereas in this world it's about your relationship. So you think of yourself as a member of your clan or extended family. Okay, now most people think that the small monogamous nuclear families that characterize Western societies, for example, emerge after the Industrial Revolution. So people start getting wealthy and then they do the sensible thing and make small families. That's of course not what rich people do in Saudi Arabia and other people when they don't suddenly start making small families. So we have the test of what happens when people get rich. But in any case, that's what people think. But I don't think the data supports that. We know that the data is clear that the nuclear family goes back to at least 1400, 1500 in Europe. So that's before the Industrial Revolution. And here I'm drawing on this book by Jack Goody, but a number of other historians or he's an anthropologist, but historians have made the same point, that in fact it was the church's efforts, which began in late antiquity, which gradually broke Europeans down into these monogamous nuclear families. So you might be familiar with the incest taboos, and just to give you a sense of how embedded this is, it's embedded in English, of course. So when you refer to your in-laws, you say sister-in-law, brother-in-law, father-in-law. Most people don't realize the in-law part is in canon law. So she's your sister in canon law, which means no sex or marriage with her if you're male. And that was a reminder because affines, meaning in-laws in many societies, are possible marriage partners. So in a polygynous society, after you marry one sister, you might marry the next sister. Or, even if that's not allowed, if your wife dies, naturally you want to maintain the relationship with the same family. It's about relationships. So you would get one of the younger sisters to replace the older sister. But the church put an end to that. In fact, that was one of the very first things they did. Then they banned first cousin marriage, and then they expanded the circle. Sometime around 1000 CE, it goes out to 6 cousins. Then in the Fourth Lateran Council, it's brought down to just include third cousins. But it does expand quite widely, and it includes spiritual relatives and these affinial relatives. So that's that. Of course, polygyny is banned, had been common in Europe. There were sort of primary and secondary wives. And the church also banned sex slaves. No arranged marriages. In the Christian ceremony, the bride has to say, "I do." That's actually quite rare cross-culturally. Usually nobody asks the bride what her view is. But here this is the priest being like, "Let's do one last check. Are you okay with this?" All right. And the church also discourages corporate ownership of land. Now, Goody makes the point the church has got self-interest here because the Archbishop of Milan, Ambrose, figured out that he could get people to donate to the church if he convinced them that you donate to the church, we give it to the poor, and then there's a passage in Mark which says that long story. But in any case, the church figured out a way that they convinced people that if they gave to the church, they'd have a better chance of getting to heaven. Now, of course, the idea was to give during your life. Most people didn't want to do that, so they would give on their deathbed. And then they would get, the idea is they could get to heaven. So that led the church to become one of the richest, or the richest institution in Europe, and gradually accumulate quite a bit of land. Okay, but that affected the inheritance system. Okay, so finally I want to mention this. This is part of the many modern weddings today, but it actually traces back to the Carolingian period. So many of you are probably familiar with it. So if anyone here can show just cause while this couple cannot be lawfully joined in holy matrimony, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. And then there's like a pregnant pause and everybody looks around. This is an incest inquiry. This is, again, the priest saying, let's make sure these two aren't relatives. We've got everyone together here who could possibly know if they're relatives. And let's do one final check. And then if we make sure they're not cousins, then we can finally join them. So this is part of this effort that the Carolingian Empire went to, teaming up with the priests and the Pope and stuff, to try to end this incest problem. Okay, so this is all suggests, and then by 800 we begin to see actual statistical evidence, and then the amount of evidence we have that this is operating seems to grow over time after that. Okay, now to make this into a scientific program, now I got to move into the modern world and use data to see if we can find evidence for the kinds of effects that I'm suggesting occur. So my task, this is published in the journal Science, is to, if this is true, I should be able to link the church's, the spread of the church, the marriage and family program, to differences in kin-based institutions. So I need data on something like rates of cousin marriage, rates of polygyny, things like that. I should be able to link those to psychological data, and then I should be able to go this way. All right. So just to give you the highest level data I can possibly show you, well, this is global data. So these are different countries around the world. This is centuries under the medieval church of these populations. And I just picked the easy thing to understand. I have more complicated measures I could show you, but an easy thing to understand would be the rate of cousin marriage. So more centuries under the medieval church, less cousin marriage around the world. If we take the rate of cousin marriage, so that's a log scale, and then we found data on 17 different psychological variables at the country level. And just for simplicity, we add them all up and create a single index. And we called it the Individualistic Impersonal Psychology Index. And greater cousin marriage means less individualism, less impersonal trust, the things that are in this scale. Fairly strong relationship. Now, I could show you the data for every single one of the 17, and you'd see the same pattern. So there's no hidden stuff behind the curtain. So it's all in the paper. Okay, and then finally I can go this way. So more centuries under the church, more individualistic impersonal psychology. Now, in many of these measures, we have data on the Western church and the Eastern church. And historically, the evidence seems to suggest that the Eastern Church had a kind of weak version of this marriage and family program that dissolved the Western families into small monogamous nuclear families. They were kind of late, the bands didn't go out as far, and they were less enthusiastic about it. But it did occur, and we frequently see this pattern where we get a weak effect for the Eastern Church and then a strong effect for the Western Church. So more individualism and impersonal psychology there. So this, at least globally, it fits with the basic pattern. Now, we can add all kinds of fancy controls to this, but it's still cross-national data, and whenever you see cross-national data, you should be suspicious, because everything correlates cross-nationally. There's lots of correlations. So what we did to kind of dig into this more deeply is we created a database of bishoprics around Europe, and so we have a GPS location for each bishopric, and we have a date. So we can track this spread of the church. You'll see sometimes the red dots will turn gray, and that means that that part of Europe is under a political power that's unfriendly to the bishop in Rome, to the Pope. So we don't count the period when it's under Islamic power, say, and you'll see that Spain gets conquered and various parts of Italy get conquered. It's also sometimes they're under the Orthodox Church or under the bishop in Constantinople, so not under the Roman side. So this goes from 500 to 1500. And so we get this dosage measure. You'll see Ireland is interesting, right? People tend to think Ireland got Christianity early, right? St. Patrick and whatnot. But that brand of Christianity did not have the marriage and family program as part of it. Ireland doesn't get the marriage and family program until the Normans arrived there, much later, 12th century, 13th century. Okay, so this gives your dosages around Europe. In this map, we include the Carolingian borders in blue, because the Carolingians played an important role. They're also an important political border in 800. And then the Iron Curtain also is there. Okay, so what we do is we have 4 psychological dimensions that we get from the European Social Survey. So a measure of individualism, a measure of conformity and obedience, measure of impersonal fairness, and impersonal trust. I'm happy to talk more about those if people want to hear more. So we these psychological measures, and what we do is we use the exposure of each region to predict the individual psychology. So in the analysis, we're explaining the psychological traits of individuals, and we're using where they live and how long that region has been under the church's influence. So our findings are that individuals from regions with longer church exposure have greater impersonal trust, greater impersonal fairness, less conformity and obedience, and greater individualism independence. In this analysis, what we can do is we only compare regions within the same country. So there's nothing about national health care systems or GDP or anything in this, because we're only comparing within countries. We have individual demographics, income and education, as well as age. So it's not an income effect. It's not an education effect. We're only comparing college degree people with other college degree people. We have lots of geographic variables. We have climatic variables. And one might worry that it's somehow the church is associated with Roman influence. So we have historical maps of the Roman roads that interconnected the Roman Empire. And we can use proximity to Roman roads as a measure. And so it's not part of that. We use initial prosperity in 500, the presence of medieval universities, monasteries, the Carolingian Empire, all as controls in this analysis, and the result holds. One of the most persuasive analyses for me is if you say, let's forget Western Europe and just focus on everything on the other side of the Iron Curtain, we get the same results over there. So if we just look at what the former Soviet bloc, right, what's the other side of the curtain. All right, so this is one set of analyses. Now, I also the sort of job I gave the team, the job I gave myself to figure out was that I should be able to show that more exposure to the Western church predicts things about kinship. So I could show you analyses showing that more time under the church leads to less cousin marriage across Europe. But I thought I'd show you these plots instead, which are saying the amount of cousin marriage, and this is based on a 20th century measure, and the amount of individualism independence based on the same measure I just showed you, so from the European Social Survey. So places with more cousin marriage are less individualistic and independent, just looking within Europe. You can see we got data from Italy, Spain, France, and Turkey. We don't have data from everywhere, so this is just the particular regions of those countries where we could find data. And we put Turkey on there. Now, everything holds if we remove Turkey, but I think it's worth noting that Turkey falls exactly where you'd expect it if you know its cousin marriage rate. So this is a place with a very different history, but yet once you know its cousin marriage rate, you can say something about its psychology. Okay. Same thing with impersonal fairness. So more cousin marriage, less impersonal fairness. And again, there's Turkey where it should be, and then everything else falls in there. Conformity and obedience, so more cousin marriage, greater conformity and obedience, and more cousin marriage, less impersonal trust. And again, Turkey's down there. We can add a number of different bells and whistles to this and try to control for various things. In general, the result holds. It's not a huge data set like the previous one, because we only have these 68 regions of Europe, but that's what we got. Now, this analysis solves a number of problems. So we use the European Social Survey, and we only look at second-generation immigrants. So these are people who moved to Europe from other places, and they had kids. That's this. And then the kids take the European Social Survey. So we only compare second-generation immigrants with second-generation immigrants. They grew up in Europe. They speak the language fluently. They went to the European schools, all that kind of stuff. But yet they had families and possibly social networks that were from other places. And so what we do is we attach to that person the measure of the kinship intensity, this thing that we think is the key thing going on, how sort of interconnected families are and whatnot, the structure of the social network, or cousin marriage or church duration to this individual, and then we try to explain their psychology based on where their parents came from, essentially. And what we find is that individuals whose parents come from places with less kinship intensity or less cousin marriage have greater impersonal trust, greater impersonal fairness, less conformity and obedience, and greater individualism and independence. So the same patterns that we would expect where there's some cultural transmission coming from the parents or the social networks the parents create to the kid that cashes out. Now, when I present this, there's always people who are thinking about immigration debates usually ask questions, so I'll just address that now. This data allows us to look at the strength of these factors, and what we find is that going from first generation to second generation to third generation, the effect declines by an order of magnitude each generation. So we can detect it because we got a really big sample, but it's much smaller than first generation, and then third generation, it's even smaller. We can often still detect it, and then very hard to detect in fourth generation. Okay, and then in this case, we can have our usual hold constant, all of the same stuff. We add feelings of being discriminated against in case people from different places get discriminated against different amounts. And we can do other fancy stuff. So one of the fancy things we do is if you have mothers from the same country but different ethno-linguistic groups, then we can hold constant the country where the person came from and just compare people with moms that were from different ethnic groups in the same country. It's just another way of kind of removing other sources of variation. Okay, so that was kind of, that's the European analysis. There's also evidence, which is not in the book, because it came later, from Africa. So this is Augustin Bergeron's work. He's an economist. And what he did is we have a map of historical Christian missions all over Africa, so places where missionaries went. And then he's studying people in the city of Kananga, which is a large city in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And he looks at where people are from, what their home villages are, which are often pretty far away and scattered all over the DRC. And then he sees if he can use the proximity of the home village to these Christian missions to predict whether they have these more intense kinship networks, and then whether they're morally universalistic and in-group loyalty. And the patterns he finds is that when you're closer to the Christian mission, you have these smaller, more nuclear families, and you have a more morally universalistic psychology, less concerns about in-group loyalty. So the same pattern we would expect, except now we replicate it in the DRC. I often get in debates with European historians who will come up with some story about how it's the European elites having some complicated thing going on, and I'm like, well, how does that explain the Democratic Republic of Congo finding? So you got to test these ideas in different places. So then looking at China and India, in this case, we have variation in kinship intensity measured by clans, except now rather than the church being the thing that affects kinship, there's a large literature suggesting that paddy rice agriculture intensifies clans. And so using this, we can explain the variation around Han Chinese only. So throw out all other groups, just focus on Han Chinese. Han Chinese from places with more clans, where it's associated with more paddy rice agriculture, approach the world with less analytic thinking and a more interdependent self-concept and more concerns about in-group loyalty. So the same pattern, basically. And this is from the US. So as the US is expanding, cousin marriage is popping up in various places and getting to some non-trivial thresholds. So various states start enacting cousin marriage laws. And so Goshen colleagues, who's an economist at the University of British Columbia, shows that when states enact their laws against cousin marriage, you have a decline in cousin marriage, and this leads to greater income and urbanization later. So there I don't have the psychological data, but I can show the expected economic effects. All right. So finally, I want to say a few things about innovation, and this is kind of the latest stuff on the agenda. So in my prior work, I developed this idea that a lot of human innovation knowledge comes from the interaction among diverse minds. So most novel ideas are actually recombinations of existing ideas. So if you get people with a lot of different ideas together and let them interact, they can make baby ideas. And so if this is true, then we should expect the size of a population and the amount of cognitive diversity and the interconnectedness to interact to create faster innovation. Okay, now in The Weirdest People in the World, I apply this saying that the social factors that I talk about, which I ultimately anchor in the church and these psychological changes, so greater urbanization, that's always going to create more innovation. Immigration is going to create more because immigrants bring diverse ideas. These institutions are different. So the apprenticeship and journeyman institutions are different in Europe than other places, and I'll just give you one key element. So the journeyman phase, after you've been trained by one master to be a craftsman of some sort, say, you then have to go do what I think of as a postdoc in another master's shop. And it has to be far away, like there's a rule that it can't be nearby. That means you're remixing with a bunch of other guys coming from other places who worked under other masters. It's an environment that's really ripe for new recombinations because you're bringing together ideas that would normally never see each other if everybody keeps their ideas combined. And of course, universities are spreading, knowledge societies are spreading, coffee houses. And in the book, I show how knowledge societies have an impact on British innovation. This one is actually relevant for urbanization because this is, so from 1100 to 1900, and this is, I call this the size of the collective brain, but it's just a number of other people that one person might have access to. And what I did is I said, well, let's assume you can access everybody in your city, and then your ability to access people in other cities depends on the cost for getting to that city. And so then if you then sort of add up how many people can I access, discounting people in other cities by the cost of travel there, then you get this kind of thing where the size of the collective brain, the number of people that any one person can access is getting big rapidly right around the time the Industrial Revolution occurs. Okay, psychological factors are important too, because if you trust and cooperate with strangers, then you're more likely to share ideas, interact, collaborate with people you don't know, are members of your family, those kinds of things. Individualism, if you want to be the smartest guy in the room or impress everybody, then that's an incentive as opposed to being conformist, keep your ideas to yourself, stay in line, that kind of thing. Also, obviously, a novelty preference, breaking with tradition is going to help here, and tolerance of religious differences, because then you can access more of those ideas that are in different minds. All right, so what we did is we took the database of patents between 1980 and 2014, and my colleagues did most of the hard lifting here, and we tried to explain variation just within Europe. So I've already shown you this link going from the church to aspects of weird psychology, and that's a map of weird psychology, just combining all four of the traits that I talked about. It's also, you can take modern families, so this is the percentage of nuclear families, or Facebook friends greater than 100 kilometers. So we also have Facebook data. So we can make this connection. And then we can show these two links, so we can make these connections and explain patterns using aspects of psychology and families. And then we can do this one. So that's this one. So more exposure to the medieval church, more patents per capita. Just comparing Europeans with Europeans, only analyzing within the same country, and using these very small regions to compare. Okay. Now, we can do other analyses to improve this. Okay. Yeah, I can talk about that at the end. Okay, I'll just mention this. I've run a little bit over time here, so I just want to, I'll say this very briefly. One of the things I was trying to explain is, Weber asked this question. Well, he didn't ask this question. He made the proposal that Protestantism played a big role in the rise of capitalism and markets and things like that. But I think one of the questions I wanted to address is, how do you get to Protestantism in the first place? So it's a highly individualistic religion. I talked a lot about mental states early on, and whether you meant to steal it or you stole it by accident. In Protestantism, you can get to heaven just based on mental states. So faith alone gets you to heaven as opposed to faith and good works. It's a very strange idea in the context of world religions. And the idea that individuals should read the Bible for themselves is really peculiar. Why should we give every schmuck a chance to read the Bible for themselves and have an opinion? But this led to the widespread literacy, because people had to learn to read the Bible for themselves. It was thought that everybody should do this, boys and girls. So Protestant populations figured out ways to educate boys and girls so they were literate. And what the fun part, most people don't realize, is that when you learn to read, it changes your brain. So it thickens your corpus callosum. It gives you a specialized region in your left ventral occipital temporal region. It alters part of your superior temporal sulcus and left inferior prefrontal cortex. And it improves your verbal memory, because you can make a picture of the word. And it creates larger patterns of brain activation even when you hear speech. So you hear speech, and part of your brain is actually turning it into words, right, to written stuff. Now, it also shifted facial recognition to the right hemisphere. So the current thinking is that we needed some neurogeography. And so when we learn to read, we drive out some of the facial recognition. And that means literate people become right hemisphere biased for facial recognition. So for a long time, neuroscientists were telling us humans are naturally right hemisphere biased for facial recognition. Turns out that's mostly about literate people are right hemisphere bias, because we've used some neurogeography for something else. Anyway, key closing points is you have to think about psychology as co-evolving with institutions and other aspects of culture. And this affects how those institutions operate. So plucking an institution that evolved in one society and dropping it on another society, which is a favorite activity of Europeans for a long time, it doesn't work because it doesn't fit with the psychology that exists there, right? There are different expectations and a whole set of dynamics. Deep history matters for economic outcomes. So if we want to understand the contemporary world, we have to understand history. So plug for the historians. Important to note here, I'm talking a lot about culture and cultural groups. This is a story of not essentializing cultural groups, but of dynamic change over time. So, if you look at Europe in 1000 CE, there were Islamic scholars who would talk about the northern barbarians. And by that they meant the English and the Dutch and stuff, who they thought were unsophisticated, uncouth, and stupid. And there was a big change in Europe over that 1,000-year period. And then I made this point previously about cultural evolution being a type of biological evolution, but not genetic evolution. All right, that's it.
Joe, that was just fabulous. There's so much there, one hardly knows where to start. I'm going to take advantage of the fact that I've got the mic at the moment, just to ask you a question first. And just picking up on what you were saying right at the end about Weber. And I'm thinking about this from a Ramsay Center perspective, because our university programs, as you all know, focus on the great books of the past. So we always like to put the things that we hear from the speakers in the context of kind of long tradition of thinking about whatever it is. And so thinking about what you just said about Weber, who talks about ascetic Protestantism, and he says, of course, that Protestantism leads to the rise of capitalism. So he traces this back to Luther, like you did. But I'm thinking even more about Alexis de Tocqueville in Democracy in America, and you quote a sentence from de Tocqueville at the beginning of one of your chapters. I think I can see the whole destiny of America contained in the first Puritan who landed on these shores. And de Tocqueville also says, as each person concentrates on himself, men become more equal and more detached from their fellows. And the idea of devotion to one's kin, in your model, becomes more foreign. Democracy destroys the instinct for devotion. This is the talk. So I'm thinking there's strong parallels between what you're saying and what people like Weber and de Tocqueville are saying. But the difference is that they're talking about not the West, but modernity. So this is a conversation that's been going on for a long time, 200 years, in the West, about what it is to be modern. And you segued that into a conversation in the West about what it is to be Western. So can you just talk about that? In a sense, I see what you've done as a wonderful kind of late addition to a tradition of conversation in the West about modernity, but now it's become something about Westernness. So can you
Yeah, I mean, it's one thing is interesting because the idea of characterizing something as modernity doesn't appeal to me. I want something much more specific that I can get my hands on and explain. So if you want to discuss something like the breaking down of family ties or the relative lack of importance of the family or moral universalism, I would break it down into a series of elements and just talk about how those elements change over time. I wouldn't want to put a label on it because that makes it difficult and unwieldy. And the other thing is eventually modernity will be the past. And so if you want to think long term, you don't want to use terms like that. Because then you got to add neo and then, yeah. So, to get back to your question, I do think that, I think it's worth seeing my enterprise as related to Weber and de Tocqueville. And I think they made many of the same observations. As I mentioned, I was trying to really get to Weber. And then one of the things I do in the book is I look at some of the modern evidence that actually supports some of the things that Weber said. So if you compare Protestant and Catholic Germans based on whether they happen to live in a place that went Catholic or Protestant due to the decisions of some prince or duke in the 16th century, you can see differences in how many hours they spend at work. So you can see evidence of the Protestant work ethic and whatnot. The same is true in the use of mental states. So Jimmy Carter, former president of the U.S., famously talked about how guilty he felt when he had impure thoughts about women. But other religious traditions, like Jews, for example, and this is researched by Paul Rosen, don't feel such guilt about that. It's about actions. It's not about thoughts. So just to give you an example. And I think one of the things that fits with the de Tocqueville thought is that the migrants to the U.S. had an advantage because they didn't have these structures that existed that had to be torn down in places like France. If you look back into European history, there was democracy, or at least representative governments at the local level, beginning in the High Middle Ages. It just took a long time for, how are we going to govern our town, where you had a town council and the town would make group decisions and there were representatives from the different guilds, to get that up to the national level where there was elites and royal blood and all that kind of stuff. So you can think of it as an up-trickling from the kind of a grassroots thing. Go to the U.S., there's no elites to fight with. I mean, some came over, of course, but.
Okay. So that's great, thank you. I'm hoping we'll get back to reading at the end. That's a question I want to ask, but there are a lot of hands. So can we start right at the end of that? Can I ask people to just identify themselves and, if possible, keep the questions reasonably short, unlike me?
Yep, this will be short. Luther probably was somewhat similar to Immanuel Kant in his cultural construction, i.e. Northern Germany, that German kind of deontological morality, as in never ever tell a lie, even if the Nazis turn up at Anne Frank's house and says, "Where's Anne Frank?" Versus maybe a socialistic type of morality, a la Jeremy Bentham and consequentialism and utilitarianism. So maybe the bifurcation is not Europe versus the Orient. It may not be temporal. Maybe it's Benthamite consequentialism versus deontological ethics, which obviously has a temporal and civilizational facet to it as well. That could be another interpretation of the data.
But then why would I be able to use the medieval church diffusion?
I've worked in a medieval church institution, and I can give you an example of that because I have seen it. I have looked after mentally handicapped people in a Catholic church institution in France, and I have noticed there that French aristocrats do send their inbred mentally damaged children into church organisations where they can be cared for by blah, blah, blah. Presumably, they never told me, it was above my pay grade. The idea is we'll look after your kids from cradle to grave. They won't breed, and then you'll give us some money into the church, and this will make the Western Church powerful. You know, since the Carolingian, Charlemagne crowned himself in the year 800 or whenever it was. So anyway, the church has done those sorts of things throughout time. I'm sure that's quite correct. There's nothing wrong with that data. It's just that, possibly, as well as that factor, I'm not saying that's falsified, there are other explanations, such as philosophical developments, a la Kant versus Bentham, a la socialism versus capitalism, a la past, ancient times, Greco-Roman stuff versus barbarian stuff. Okay. But yeah, the church thing works well. It's a very nice anthropology. It's plausible.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that has been our approach is that, if there's another hypothesis out there, or these don't have to be mutually exclusive, is that we try to find some data. So the question would be: is there something that we could measure that could capture the dimension you had in mind? So you saw all the kinds of controls we put in there. One thing I didn't mention in some of those analyses is that there is an independent effect of whether someone's Protestant on those outcomes. I was focusing on the duration of the church, but there is that Protestant bump on a bunch of those. So there could be other factors that playing a role. Just my job is to figure out how to measure it.
Hi. I'm so impressed that you've just come off a transatlantic flight, and thank you so much. It was fascinating. I have I'm Lucy. I have two questions, both of them potentially odd or curveball-ish. The first is, how would you place Judaism in what you've been describing? And I ask that as someone who is very interested in Judaism. My ex-husband is Jewish. I am still interested in converting. You don't have to answer that if you don't want to. The other question is, I don't know if you or anyone else in the room read the FT's piece that's going to appear in this weekend's paper on godlike AI, and as an anthropologist, how you feel about the advent of godlike AI. Completely unrelated and yet relevant, I would think, as a journalist who was at The Economist for a very long time.
Okay, well, great question.
Either or.
Okay. The initial prelude chapter on reading used to be longer, because one of the things I wanted to dig into was I make the case there that which is the case I made just a few minutes ago, is that the spread of literacy was driven by Protestantism. And one of the things economists do is they use the distance from Wittenberg, and they look at literacy in the 19th century, and the closer you are to Wittenberg, the more literate. And Luther has these great quotes where Protestantism will spread from Wittenberg like stone on a pond, the waves from a stone. And that actually looks like part of what happened. But one could say the printing press. So not too long before that, the printing press appears in a different part of Germany, in Mainz. And you can put the distance from Mainz in, and it looks pretty good. But anyway, it's a common alternative hypothesis. But there is another group that was highly literate long before any Europeans were, and that's Jews. So after the destruction of the Second Temple, it became a norm for Jewish men to have to learn to read the Torah for themselves. It was, part of being a Jewish man was being literate, being able to read. You would learn to read Aramaic script, but the Torah. And so this meant that Jews, at least men, were highly literate relatively early on. So, 1,000 years before, or what is it long? Well, 1,000 years. I mean, it took a while for this to spread. So let's say 1,000 years for fun. Before Luther, you had Jews were completely literate. They were entering urban populations. They were doing all the things that go along with literacy. So that's part of the story there. But then they created these large, long trade networks. So then they communicated through letters, and they were very market integrated. So they had a bunch of the elements that you would think would lead to a weirder psychology, except they also maintain strong family ties. So there's some interesting third story to be told there that's neither, analytic thinkers tend to think along lines, but this is more like a branching puzzle type deal. Another fun fact, though, is that if you look at one of the pieces of evidence I use in the book is the change in kinship terminology in different European languages. And you see them go from the kinds of complex kinship terminology that typical agriculturalist societies have, where you have different words for mother-in-law and different kinds of cousins and stuff, to the simple terminology that is common in English and other Western languages. And when that occurs. So it seems to occur right when you expect it. It occurs first in the Latin languages, so Spanish, Italian, French, and then later in the Germanics. And it occurs throughout all the Germanic dialects except one, and that's Yiddish. And so Yiddish never gets the new terminology. It still uses the old terminology from the complex days. So anyway, it's a fun piece of evidence. And I think I'm going to pass on the AI one.
But we might come back to reading in a minute. Yes, the gentleman just here. Hang on, wait for the mic.
How do you reconcile the nations which value non-conformity with the fact that those same nations seem to be the very most conformist at the moment? They bow down to woke culture and cancel culture. They seem to accept basically forced vaccinations. It seems to be a paradox.
Well, I guess I like to think that there's a lot of debate about those things. So aren't there a lot of anti-wokers out there? Yeah. What's that? Well, okay. I don't know. I think there's lively debate about all those topics, which is why we're having that debate right now, or that discussion right now. But I should say, let me just, so all humans are conformists, right? So it's a matter of degree, right? Everybody wants to go along with their peers and stuff like that. So, psychologists do this thing called the Asch conformity test, where they have, a few people ahead of you who are actually confederates of the experimenter give the same obviously wrong answer. And then the question is, how long does the subject say what the other people said versus say what they would perceive to be the correct answer? And everybody conforms to some degree in all populations. It's just a matter of the degree of conformity.
My name's Chris. I do research in neuroscience and genetics, and I found your presentation very interesting. I had a question about if there was any divergence in your data between looking at, for example, the church and the Protestant church and places where there was more or less cousin marriage in general. Because if not, how do we not know if some of these effects, or if not all the effect, is just coming from growing up in a polygenic society? So a polygenic or a society of high genetic diversity, right. Could that just be what's driving this change rather than the church?
Right. So let's see. The first thing we do, I was showing cousin marriage in this talk because it's easy to understand. But really the main measure we use was, you saw it pop up there, the kinship intensity index. And we created that from that ethnographic atlas, which I mentioned, that has all those different kinship for different societies. And so we took whether you have clans, polygyny, and things about your inheritance system, whether you have nuclear families, and we rolled that together into an index. Now that includes cousin marriage, but that's our main predictor. So cousin marriage isn't playing a big role there. So that's one piece. And if I wanted to test your idea, I could drop cousin marriage out, and I think I would still capture it. There's an economist named Ben Anke who, he's kind of working in parallel. We're both at Harvard and we're having beers together sometimes. So, and he developed a version of this. His kinship intensity index doesn't have cousin marriage. And he has a paper published in economics which does similar kinds of things. So I feel confident that it's not the cousin marriage thing. Having said that, we have a paper that's in manuscript form. And what we did is we took satellite imagery of the entire world at night. And that gives us measures in lumens, and we use it as a proxy for economic productivity. So basically, parts of the Earth that are more lit up are more economically productive. And we can hold constant population density. So we're actually interested in extra luminosity above and beyond what your population density would predict. And we show that having a low KII, not very much kinship intensity, having small nuclear families, is associated with lots of luminosity, right? So we link it to economic growth. And then we do an analysis where we get data from genetic data. And we want to generate another proxy measure for this kinship intensity. So we look at the runs of homozygosity. So you're going to create runs of homozygosity when your people are marrying close relatives. And places with more homozygosity have less light intensity, which then comes back to your question, is maybe it has to do with this kind of genetic diversity. That's where you're going, right? So then this question comes up directly for us in the paper, and we look at the available data on the relationship between the amount of this homozygosity and IQ measures and education measures. And we find that effect is teeny compared to the large effect we see in our study. So the contribution, it can't be the main factor. It could be a small factor.
So lady just here.
Hey, I'm Winnie. My question is a bit broad. I think it generally is around, what do you think will happen in the future given the rates of globalization? We have so many more people migrating to different countries and such a sharing and influx of different ideas, and particularly between kingship-intensive, I guess, societies and non-kingship-intensive societies. Do you think that there will be a unification of traits, particularly psychologically, across the world in the future? Or do you actually think that it'll be more combative and potentially more of like a Darwinistic kind of, well, certain traits will be selected and they will probably be one or the other or some like new type?
Yeah, great question. So, and this gets to this, I guess I'm going to pitch the don't think along a linear line. So I think there is a loss of a lot of the diversity we had seen, but I think we're seeing the creation of new social forms, new institutional forms. So if you think about just Japan and China, for example, in 1880, the Japanese take in a lot of Western institutions. They actually copy law codes from places like Switzerland, verbatim. In China, the same thing happens in 1950 or so. They adopt Western marriage, a number of other things. But then, of course, these societies have their own indigenous institutions, which then get remolded. And so, they're on new trajectories which haven't been seen before in history, because they have some Western institutions in there, but then they have lots of the local institutions, and they've created this hybrid, which is like nothing that existed before. So it's going to be a new kind of psychology that hadn't been seen in the world in the past. It's not going to be Western, but it's not going to be like traditional Chinese or Japanese psychology. So an old variation being destroyed, new variation being created.
Time for a couple more. Was there?
Okay, I've got a question. I'm Karen Kuhlman. I very much enjoyed your presentation. I have two questions. One question is, do you think, at a very general level, people are becoming smarter or more intelligent from the biological processes that are taking place? And the second question relates to a theory I had when I was a Jane Austen fan in, sort of early teens. And that was, I used to ponder on the idea of whether people were becoming smarter and were getting all this innovation at the time I was growing up in the 70s and 80s because of the decline of arranged marriages in the West. And my thinking was that you didn't have to marry someone that your parents knew. You could marry someone that you wanted, and therefore, if you were a smart person, you could marry another smart person, then you'd have smarter children. So that was a very dodgy theory from me at 12 or 13. But I just wondered what your thoughts were on it.
Yeah, fun question. So. So I have some work on IQ, which I think the way to think about IQ, and I don't think we think about it correctly, because we think about it as this general raw intelligence. I think we should think about it as a specialized set of cognitive abilities for navigating the world we've created. So IQ has risen dramatically in the last century, so much so that someone from 1900, the average IQ would be 70 if scaled by modern standards. So in that sense, IQs are higher. So what people are good at is navigating the world we live in. Now you might say, well, doesn't that mean they're smarter? Well, it means they're better adapted to this environment. But we have this project, which I'm going to next month in Namibia, and we're studying the effects of schools on children. We have the same ethnic group. One is in Angola where there's no schools, and one is in Namibia where there are some schools. So we get to track child's cognitive development in a whole bunch of domains with and without education. And the kids with no schools are better at spatial tracking. So if I say, where's Broome? You can be like, they know immediately, they're geolocating all the time. And they are also better at raw pattern recognition. So they're not bringing a bunch of expectations that come from school and stuff. So and there's lots of other cognitive domains too, which I think we lose when we educate people. So if those could be smart in a context of being a hunter-gatherer or trying to survive. I mean, being able to get home is pretty important, right? And I actually think having GPS is making our spatial navigation abilities even worse, right? You used to kind of at least look at the map and figure out which way was north. Now you're like, oh. So anyway, so I think that's a big thing. And what was the second part of your question? Oh, yeah, no, we think we have real data on this, which is that what's happening since women entered the labor market, so say in the US, that's the early 1970s, and now with these dating apps, is you're getting a lot more people who are mating with people who are similar to themselves. So the economists are marrying other economists and making baby economists. And what that does is it pushes out the ends of the genetic distributions, right? So it doesn't change the mean, but it means you're getting people with more extreme traits, right? If autistic people marry other autistic people, then, you know, so that's the idea. So that it is affecting the genetic pool in an interesting way.
We've got time for maybe one more. Was there a hand somewhere? There, Tom.
Tom, just given all of the changes that are happening in society now, the significant changes with marriage, with all those things, what would be the one or two things that you would say in terms of policy advice that you would say to senior policy advisors?
I generally don't give policy advice.
Right.
Okay. Very wise.
Well, so I'm working.
We won't hold you to it, whatever you say, Joe.
So I'm interested in the collective brain and the idea that innovation is driven by cognitive diversity and urbanization. So things that bring people together with diverse ideas, any policy that encourages that. So, and I've been trying to study the immigration policy in the US, and it looks like immigration has been a powerful driver of US innovation over most of the histories, although the H-1B visa is a failure because it ties immigrants too tightly to the company, and they're not able to go out and interact and start new businesses with other locals. But if you look at something like, so in 1924, the US banned immigration from a whole bunch of places, and this drove down productivity in a number of areas, and actually made native-born Americans less creative, less patenty, because they don't get the ideas coming in and then make new ideas with that. So that sounded kind of policy related.
Fair enough. I think we do have to stop very quickly, though, on reading, if I may. And I'm asking this because increasingly I'm feeling that the Ramsay Centre's project, more than anything else, is reading, encouraging young people to read. And one says this to undergraduate audiences with a greater and greater sense of urgency, because reading is harder and harder for young people to do because they're doing this all the time, right? So what I guess what I'm wondering is, do you think that the very technique and skill of reading, which sparked off the modernization that you've been talking about, is receding, and young people are becoming less literate at the same time as they're becoming more atomized because they're buried in the screen all the time? So those two effects are quite worrying, don't you think?
Yeah, and so, I mean, I haven't looked at research on this, but given what we know about how people are affected by technologies and other factors, it would seem that people are getting shorter attention spans. Yeah. And the sort of deep reading, I'm going to sit down and read this book for 3 hours. Yeah. And I'm going to focus, I'm going to be in the zone, you know. You don't see,
because if reading has those
even
effects,
I think even you know, people who were less affected by the technology, just the email and the websites and stuff like that, you really want to close all that off and just you and the text.
Yeah. I mean, if reading has the good effects that you're talking about, and then we read less, then that's a bad thing. Right. Anyway, fellow weirdos, I think we should say a very big thank you to somebody who's just got off a very long flight to deliver this wonderful talk. Very grateful to Joe Henrich. Thank you, Joe.